we live in a dry environment to some degree. I felt, our biodiversity that we all appreciate, particularly our bird life, is really focused on our river areas, our riparian areas. And we all know the importance of those areas, the Bow River and the Elbow River and Nose Creek. And even within Queen's Park Cemetery, there's a great little riparian habitat. It's a stormwater outflow in a sense, but people go there to look for those interesting birds like varied thrushes and wintering goldfinches and things like that. And without that riparian habitat, what they call the emerald threads that weave their way through the prairie provinces, we'd be much more impoverished in terms of our biodiversity. But it's people like Kerri who are championing those areas through her work with the cows and fish program. Kerri was telling me that she's been there at 24 years, which is amazing to be working hard to protect those areas. She comes with us with a Bachelor of Science degree in Environmental and Conservation Science from the University of Alberta. She's also a professional agrologist. And so she's got a lot of experience for helping out with the riparian and knowledgeable of the riparian environment. And it's great pleasure to have Kerri here to explain to us the importance of the riparian habitat, what's it all about, perhaps the critters that live there, and how to manage those important areas. So without further ado, I would call upon Kerri to share her screen and provide us with a presentation on riparians.
Excellent. Thanks very much, John. Well, it is a great pleasure for me to be invited to speak to Nature Calgary and the members and those that are on the webinar tonight. I appreciate you taking the time to join us. And I'm actually coming to you from Edmonton, so within Treaty 6 territory. We do have other staff with Cows and Fish around the province. Throughout the presentation, at the end, I'll let you know who your more local to Calgary people might be. You got me tonight, and like I said, I'm really excited to chat and share with you a bit more information about riparian areas. As John said, that emerald thread that connects us all. So first of all, a little bit about Cows and Fish. We are a not-for-profit charitable organization. Our sort of official name is the Alberta Riparian Habitat Management Society. And we've been working in Alberta since about 1992, working with producers and communities on riparian awareness. So you can probably figure from the name, our roots are in agriculture, but riparian areas are not limited to the agricultural landscape, whether it's an urban, a lakefront, a small town, or a large city. Riparian areas are part of the environment that we live in. And now Cows and Fish just this year, or I guess in 2022, celebrated its 30th anniversary. So as a not-for-profit organization, doing this riparian thing for that long and meeting all kinds of people around Alberta, as well as throughout Canada and North America. Our being a not-for-profit, we do have a number of members and supporters, and the ones you see on your screen here are them. Alberta Beef Producers and Trout Unlimited Canada are our founding members, so the Cows and Fish connection kind of works there too. And then we also, the producers, municipalities, community groups like your individuals like yourselves are also what really drive us and allow our work and our information and our knowledge to be shared and then be applied on the ground. Our mission is to promote healthy landscapes by fostering riparian stewardship in sort of, again, whichever landscape you might live in. We sort of do that through a realm of extension that also includes, bringing people together, finding different tools that work for different things related to riparian areas, helping support and facilitate community-based action, and then monitoring and helping others sort of figure out whether things are working or not. That's sort of the pathway or the process within which Cows and Fish operates. So I guess on that note, if you've got any questions or anything like that as we go through the presentation, I would invite you to put them in the chat, and then we will address them we'll address them at the end. So with the work that I do with Cows and Fish, I started out as a field person, so out there looking at the plants, identifying the plants, recording them on our data sheets, making incidental bird observations. I wouldn't call myself a birder by any means, but I can recognize, the colorful things flying around. So getting our information, the science that we learn and that we know from our own work as well as others, getting that out to people is really, a lot about what we're doing. And one of those foundational things is, well, what is this thing called riparian? Well, really, what it is, it's the part of the landscape that does all these different things for us, things that we call functions. So trapping and storing sediment, filtering and buffering water, creating primary productivity, and maintaining biodiversity, just to name a few. The riparian lands are areas where there's a high water table, where the plants are adapted to that high water table, and typically there's water nearby. And so these near water areas, why are they so important? Well, they contribute to a number of different things by performing those functions that I just mentioned. Things like adding to resiliency, providing ecological services, and creating stable areas for not only ourselves as humans, but for our wild neighbors as well. So riparian areas, from our perspective, are associated with both flowing and non-flowing waters. So streams and rivers and springs, as well as lakes, wetlands, ponds, sloughs, and seeps, or wetlands, I guess you could say. And they're that transition zone between the aquatic environment and the uplands. Floodplains, shorelines, stream banks, those are all part of the riparian system. And whether it's a large river or a small stream, they have a riparian area. Whether it's a lake shore or a wetland fringe or a non-flowing water body, they also have a riparian area. And the water is key, as you can imagine, but that water isn't always visible. And one of the things that we know about riparian areas is that they change. They are dynamic just through the year and just from, just the natural things that are going on. Just from, this is a photo in southern Alberta, the same wetland throughout a series of time that just shows, that the water levels there change. And sometimes it's because we have not much rain. Sometimes it's because there's a lot of rain. Sometimes it's, different developments that happen nearby that change the way that water moves. But the one thing we can count on with riparian lands is that they will change. Now, we often get asked, well, where is the riparian area? And a lot of people are looking for, a number, 30 meters from the water, or 100 meters or 6 meters or whatever it is. But really, it's an ecological defined boundary. It's a place where that influence of water from a particular water body on the ground or underground or on the surface, basically where that influence ends. So usually, there's a topographic change. You're on the bottom, you're in a riparian. As you go up the hill, you're getting out of that riparian land. So it's ecologically defined by the soils, by the plants, and by the topography. And some of those plants that you may be familiar with, or maybe you've never seen before, but things like sedges, cattails, willows, and even balsam poplar are part of that riparian plant community. And whether we have native species or non-native species within our riparian system, that can sort of affect the way that it's going to function and perform those things like filtering and buffering or holding banks together and reducing erosion. On this chart, as we go from willow to Canada thistle, you can see that the bank sort of structure changes. And when we've got lots of deep binding roots on the left with the willow, it's a nice concave bank, a little bit of an overhang. And then as we sort of move to the right with Canada thistle, it's just one taproot that can't hold that bank together very well. And this is, the city of Calgary just in itself in the last 20 years or so has been able to demonstrate that diagram actually quite well over time. And there's been a couple of big floods just within recent history, like 2005 and 2013. This is just an example of sort of how the influence of vegetation affects the way that a river looks. I personally haven't been to this site, but my colleague Catherine, who is our cows and fish riparian specialist in Calgary, or one of them, took this photo. This is a spot in Souhiggins Park. So if you keep an eye on the yellow circle in the middle in 2003, you notice not a lot of deep binding roots there based on that diagram, quite a bit of bare ground. And the water is low, but that could just be the time of year. So after 2005, things really changed. The energy that the river had took out the bank, essentially eroded it away and exposed this stormwater outfall. Now in 2008, or between 2005 and 2008, there were some restoration activities that occurred at that location. Obviously, that stormwater outfall could not continue to be exposed like that. Sort of a combination of vegetation and rock were put there, vegetated riprap. Trees and shrubs were planted up along the top. So there's the vegetated riprap, and there's some of the trees that were planted along the upper terrace there, kind of on this side here. And so over time, since 2008, that site was allowed to rest and allow that work to grow and continue to set root. And you can see it looks completely different in 2014, just in a short 6 years or so. And in 2019, it continued to grow as well. The type of vegetation that you have is going to influence whether or not you have a healthy system or an unhealthy system. And a healthy one has a lot of diversity, a lot of good, what we call good plants. Typically they're native ones. That's going to function essentially better than one that's missing those same pieces. So where the bare ground becomes exposed, where the plants start to shift from ones that aren't so deep rooted to ones that are shift to ones that aren't so deep rooted, like Kentucky bluegrass or smooth brome or dandelion. On the right hand side of that photo, healthy riparian areas provide us with all these different things, right down to recreation and tourism. Clean water, fish and wildlife opportunities, a water supply that we're able to, fish or hunt or access throughout the entire year. And then when those functions aren't happening, the systems start to unravel. So then we're faced with longer periods of, or not being able to maybe bounce back quite as quick from drought, or banks falling in, lands being eroded away, flooding in places that we don't necessarily want it, blue-green algae blooms, fish kills. Now, healthy riparian areas can't stop all that per se, but can definitely, help mitigate the risk. I've said the words, sort of healthy and unhealthy a couple of times. And really what that's related to is a metric that Cows and Fish has called Riparian Health Assessment and Inventory. And essentially what it is, it's a number of questions, a number of indicators that can sort of tell us whether or not that riparian area is performing those functions without doing a lot of deep investigation in terms of, soils and that sort of thing. We can sort of get what we need for what we can see. And so a healthy system is basically functioning in a score or a rating of 80% or greater based on the 100% scale. And if it's unhealthy, it's scoring less than 60%. And if it's in the middle, it's sort of between that 60 and 80. So you can think of a riparian health assessment kind of like going to the doctor. You don't necessarily get a number when you come out from the doctor, depending on what you're doing. But you basically, they can, check a number of different, systems, and, they check your circulation, they check your blood pressure, they check your temperature, check your ears. Those are all indicators of whether or not you're healthy, depending on how things are functioning. So it's a similar idea. So if we go back to Soohiggins Park, if we think about, 2008, that particular system has some plants on it, but it's scored in that 49% range. So that's unhealthy. It does look better than it did in 2003, but it still was unhealthy. After up until 2014, the nice thing about this metric is you can repeat it in several years later. So in 2014, we went back, revisited the site, and it had bumped itself up into the healthy but with problems category. Still some bank alterations because of the work that was done there. Maybe the woody plants still not quite established. There may be some weeds in there, invasive plants. So that's some of the indicators that would be helping that score. And then as part of Catherine's work, they went back again in 2019, and you can see it looks quite different. More shrubs coming in, more different plants coming in, but it's still sort of within that, sort of holding its own within that 5 years. So it's kind of like tuning your eyes to, what's healthy and what's functioning. So we can do that work, within a city or with a particular individual, this riparian health. And then we've also been doing it across the province for a number of years. And we can see from this chart that about a quarter of the sites that we've looked at are healthy, quarter are unhealthy, and then there's about half that are in the middle. And this is based on all kinds of sites, whether it's in agriculture, urban, lakefront. This is all everything kind of put together. The sort of transition of health can be seen in the agriculture community as well, based on management changes that this particular farmer rancher made. In 2000, they were grazing this part of the river. And in 2004, they switched to a summer graze, but stopped winter grazing. And so between the first visit and the second visit in 2007, just by making that change to no more winter grazing, it's allowed the plants to pop up and start to progress into a new health category. And then in 2011, going back, they reduced the number of cows using the site. So again, still graze, just a lower stock density and stocking rate. And you can just see the way that the willows in particular have responded there. And that has also helped with increasing the health and function. And we can also see, look at that sort of revisit data provincially as well. And seeing that between initial visits, which is the yellow left-hand bar, and the revisits that have happened, which is the right-hand sort of bluish purple bar, that the number of healthy sites is going up, the number of unhealthy sites is going down, and the number of healthy but with problems is also going up. That's, particularly the trends on the ends, that's what we want to see. And what's going on in the middle, that's going to vary depending on what's happening on the outside categories. So one of the indicators that we look at that I thought you guys might be interested in is invasive plant cover and density distribution. And part of that is because it sort of relates to there's all the different types of plants that you're going to see out there. Up until 2012, we've got data that shows that these are the top 10 species that we tend to find in a riparian area. So in that floodplain, flood-prone zone, Canada thistle, perennial sow thistle, tall buttercup being the top ones. Canada thistle, perennial sow thistle by a large margin. I realize I don't have photos of those, but I'm hoping that you would be familiar with them. And based on how much cover, how much abundance there is, Canada thistle, leafy spurge, perennial sow thistle are your top three. Now this is province-wide within the data, the sites that we've been to. So we're going to be updating this data in this year actually. So I'm excited to see, whether or not this list changes or not. Sort of to bring it into Calgary a little bit. Again, this is work from Catherine. The city of Calgary has been working with Cows and Fish for over 10 years, I think, on riparian health evaluation. And these are the top occurrences of invasive plants within the city over that time. And again, the bars, the top bar, it was the first visit. The middle bar was a 2014-15 visit. And then more recently, 2019-20 is the bottom visit. So you can see that some are going up, like this tufted vetch. Others are staying the same, like toadflax. There was a bit of a bump in the middle visit, but most everything is increasing, except I would say good news, Carigana was a little bit less in 2019-20. And invasive plants, now these are plants that are noxious weeds or prohibited noxious weeds on the Weed Act, or others that are just problematic in riparian areas that tend to take over. So that's why Carigana is on that list. When you start to look at different areas of the city, these are two examples of the Weaselhead Natural Environment Park upstream of the Glenmore Reservoir and the Calgary Stampede Grounds. Healthier sites up in this Weaselhead area. It's a protected area. It's a natural area as far as I know. And there's a much higher, there's number of species found and a greater number of native species there. So the sort of native species integrity is much higher. When you compare to, a narrower remnant riparian area, like down near the Stampede Grounds, where it's just lower species richness, less native species in general, portion is less, and there's a higher number of invasives in that remnant area. So the health of a site, invasive plants play a role in that. They don't, like I said, they don't have as deep a root. They can sometimes take over. They don't make room for native species. They do provide absolute flowering throughout the year, which is benefit for pollinators. It just changes the dynamic of that native system. So that speaks to, having a diversity of plants in the riparian area is important. And that's why, we do look at overall vegetation cover, no matter what it is. Is it providing at least some of those functions of covering the ground, providing habitat, collecting water, that sort of thing. I've talked a lot about vegetation, mostly because that's what we can see. But I want to just remind you and that, that's influenced by the water and by the soil. So riparian characteristics, it's a tie-in of all those three. And from the soil's perspective, riparian areas tend to be a sponge, right? They're a place where water goes to soak in. And if we've got a healthy system, the soils tend to be light, they're porous. There's areas and room for water to go. And then if we compress that sponge, that's when we have higher runoff. We have more erosion. We have, different plants growing there that are more tolerant, to a shallow root mass or a sod pack, like, for example, a Kentucky bluegrass. And that water and that interaction with plants and soils is probably most evident right at sort of that bank and shore interface. When water moves, it has energy, it has speed, and it's got power. And that's how it erodes and ends up bringing things that we want on land, like sediment, and having it end up in the water. So the role of a river, for example, is to erode on the outside bend and deposit on the inside bend. So there is naturally an element of erosion and bare soil within a river system, even within a lake system and a wetland system. But when the system is healthy, there's a balance of that. Streams and rivers are not straight when they're in a good condition. They're wiggly, as somebody said the other day that I loved. But those meanders and those bends is what balances that energy and that horsepower. So it balances that erosion and balances that deposition and transports material from one place to the next when we want that. So, healthy systems are like the old pickup truck chugging along, just sort of, making its way slowly through the landscape. Whereas when we remove the plants, we change the soil, compact the soil, it's that water moves a lot faster. And we know why some of our landscapes have changed that way, for economic reasons or development or whatever. But it does definitely just change the way the watershed holding capacity for water results. So this is just a air photo from an area near me, just up sort of northwest of Edmonton, comparing the 1920s to the 1990s. I mean, I think if you're looking at this air photo, this is a great way to get a sense of how things used to be, because our memories are only as good as they are. You can just see the differences between the amount of vegetation, where the development is, where the hardened surfaces are, and even where some of the meanders have been taken right out. So as we compact soils, create hardened surfaces, remove wetlands, ultimately we increase peak flows, and they're much faster and often more with more impact. And then we end up with less water in the end. That's the red line here. The blue line in the middle is with wetlands intact and riparian areas intact. There's still a peak and there's still a flood potentially, but it's slower. Peak is typically not as high. And then ultimately in the end, we have more water in the system that's available for things like fish habitat. And that sort of speaks to the role of using riparian areas as a sponge, but also as an investment in groundwater. On the left-hand side, we have a flood event. Water has access to the full floodplain. It can slow down and soak in. Right-hand side, we're missing again those pieces of vegetation, soft soils, and we have just less water because it's all run off really fast. So floods are how riparian areas recharge that groundwater. So we do need them. And then, so when that happens in the spring or the summer, it puts water into that system so that then later on in the season or in a dry year, if we're not getting the rain, then water can be sort of withdrawn, or it seeps out into our streams and into our rivers and keeps them perennial, keeps them flowing all year round, which is important for our aquatic bugs, for our fish, and for a lot of our other wildlife. Again, if we're lacking that vegetation, lacking that groundwater store, we just have less water overall. And then in a dry year, it can just be exacerbated. Things are much drier, or it's drier for longer. So really, speaking to a nature club, I think reminding you guys of all those plants that you love to see out there, they are really the root of the solution. And the deep binding root ones literally are the ones that we want to see and promote. So that vegetation, the material on the top, the leaves and the stems and the branches, they reduce velocity, as well as the root systems sort of with underneath the bank. That vegetation also traps sediment. All that material that you might see on a floodplain after a flood, that's actually good stuff. That's the good mud. That's the things that the plants can then use to grow up again later. And then what happens when we don't have that is, we've seen this photo before, bare ground, places where weeds can get established, places where, if it rains, there's going to be a lot of that excess soil entering into that stream, where it could suffocate fish eggs, or it could cause water treatment issues downstream. And that's the bad mud, the material that gets into the stream channel that we don't want to see there, that, like I said, harms fish or makes it difficult for treating, or not unsuitable for drinking. That's the bad mud. And there's, again, a number of different things that can cause that. This is where floods come in again. We do have areas where bad mud is entering the stream. That water body might be carrying that sediment, but if it can flood, the water carrying that can get out onto a wider spot, drop that sediment, where then it's not an issue for the water anymore, and the plants can utilize the nutrients that might be attached to those sediment particles, or any other contaminants that might be attached. And those sort of contaminants or pollutants that you might be thinking about can come also from a number of different sources. It could be agriculture landscape, could be industry, could be urban, lakefront, yard fertilizing as well. And so as water moves, picks up sediment, these other items get attached to that sediment and then also get into the water, where then we may be faced with algae blooms. When we're faced with an algae bloom, we know that that's not good for the wildlife, not good for ourselves, whether for drinking or recreating. Again, riparian areas aren't necessarily going to remove everything, but they act as a buffer and are able to take up a lot of that material. So things like cattails, they've got that. If you ever tried to pull one out, you rarely ever get the root, and that's their deep binding root that acts not only as sort of that rebar, but also is utilizing, sucking up and grabbing and holding on to some of those other potential, when they're in the water column, contaminants. They're holding it and keeping it out of the water column. Water quality is a big part of what riparian areas do. And it doesn't really matter what you are or who you are, riparian area is important for water quality, and water quality is important. So on that note of, sort of other biodiversity, if we think about riparian areas, they are quite small in size when you look at the whole landscape, but about 80% of all of our wildlife utilize those areas for nesting, traveling, rearing their young, protection. And of course, all of the fish are going to use that aquatic zone as well. All kinds of wildlife are going to use those areas, everything from the smallest insect up through our larger animals like deer. And of course, like I said, the fish utilize that nearshore area as well. And any overhanging vegetation, right? It drops, leaves and bugs and things over into the water, which are also a food source. Now, not all animals might think having all this, biodiversity is all that great, depending on where you are in the food chain. That's life. It's just good to have a variety of things in there so that there's always something to continue on the legacy. Having that diversity is really important for resiliency in case a disease comes through, or a pest, or we have an event that takes out a certain species. By having others there, or different varieties of the same, that's how we can also again continue to maintain that biodiversity and that species richness. So you might know the story of the yellow warbler and how they have an epic 9,000 kilometer trek to get from their one migratory space to another. They weigh about 8 grams or so, which I believe is about 2 quarters in your hand. They've got a lot of miles to make and about half of that weight is fat, and that's their fuel store. As they're flying from here to there, they're going to need habitats that have a variety of things in them to fuel them up. So that's the 7-Eleven kind of for the bird world, these riparian zones. There's different heights and different structures of vegetation so that they can hide and they can stop and they can rest and they can feed. And just a little bit of science about, this is a bit older, it's dated, but it still, I think, holds true. Generally, riparian areas that are in a healthy condition have more possible and confirmed breeding birds within them, particularly because of that structure and that diversity of vegetation. The other two categories will have some, just less. And this chart shows, again, just some of the species that were found within this work up around Iron Creek. Again, higher possible number of breeding species within the healthier sites. So fish are a big part of cows and fish, as you can imagine. This is the early 1920s. What a haul, what a day's work. It's amazing that many fish could be caught in that certain, in a short period of time. Doesn't happen that much anymore. Main habitats related to creating fish and fish populations are riparian habitats. So species like bull trout are Alberta's provincial fish. They're sort of in that endangered and threatened situation. So that means that their habitats primarily are affected. Their numbers have dwindled. There's a lot of work going on now to promote recovery of habitat for bull trout as well as other trout. Again, improving riparian habitats is going to be a big part of that. So if anybody's ever been to the Raven River up in central Alberta, this was a study done there, basically showing that once riparian areas were managed differently, the livestock had been grazing along the river for a number of years, up until 1995 or so. And then they were fenced and the livestock were removed from the system for the most part. And you could see that after 20 years or so, the population was able to come back. Just that change in management helped the fish population as well. Now, since then, livestock in some areas are being reintroduced, and just with a more managed grazing approach. So if you want to know more about trout and fish in general, Alberta's Native Trout Collaborative has a website, and I encourage you to go check out opportunities for volunteering or different ways that you can help some of Alberta's native trout species. So that biodiversity also contributes to our agricultural economy as well. Having a variety of trees and shrubs in the pasture helps livestock get out of the weather, get out of the bugs, as well as provides forage. So healthy riparian areas tend to produce just more stuff, more food, more forage for grazing animals than a degraded one. And so we work with the agriculture community to recognize, what are the tools available to them for helping to improve that forage production, as well as species diversity. And some of that is recognizing that livestock do need water. Providing localized watering spots within a pasture is one tool. Doing an off-stream watering system where the water is actually pumped or piped out to a trough, and then the livestock can go there instead of right near the water, are some of the tools that we work with agriculture producers to implement. And ultimately, they recognize that the left side of the fence is going to provide longer-term resiliency for their operation as well. And so then the right-hand side, it's just finding again those tools and those people that can help out and make that happen. So just lastly, in terms of what's helping our riparian areas out there, I just wanted to touch a little bit on our friend the beaver. They ultimately create riparian habitats with their ponds and their dams. So that's a good thing. But we also know that they can create some havoc for other things, whether it's trees or it's culverts or it's roads. Typically, depending on your perspective, you kind of have a love them, hate them relationship with this little critter. Like I said, it sort of depends on your perspective, and lots of times if they're taking your trees, then you may have a less like for them. But if it's in the back 40, it might not matter so much. And we sometimes forget that, this rodent ultimately is what it is. Sort of, North America was kind of built on their backs through the fur trade. I think, whether or not wherever our perspective is, where we are on that spectrum, we do need to sort of remember how we got here. So what are the beavers doing right now? Well, being that it's winter, they're in their lodges, which is they're either out in the middle, of a pond or in a bank along a river somewhere. They've got their food cache that they built over the fall that they can access underwater. And they're basically using that lodge for protection to get out of the weather and to raise their kits that are going to be born in the spring. So the traditional or sort of conventional ways of dealing with beaver are still out there, population control as well as removing dams. But there are other folks that are trying to come up with different ways of I'll say, dealing with beaver. Recognizing that they do have value, they do create those riparian habitats, and we know why those riparian habitats are important. People like Friends of Fish Creek are utilizing coexistence tools like pond levelers and sort of culvert exclusion devices. So a pond leveler is a pipe that is placed kind of through the dam at a height that mitigates the flooding issue, but also remains enough habitat for the beaver and other wildlife that utilize it. So in terms of depth in particular. And then managing culverts is another way. This is a multi-intake fence where there's one culvert. You see the pipe with the fence around it. The fence protects the culvert from the beaver plugging it up. The pipe keeps water moving. In this particular spot, the creek was quite bandy. They created a bend with a second fence. And now that water can continue to flow even if a beaver does get in there and decide to jam some of that up. So this is right in the city of Calgary within the provincial park at Fish Creek. If you haven't checked it out, I encourage you to do so or reach out to the Friends of Fish Creek. And I imagine some of you might be members of that group as well. But ultimately, those activities are keeping the beaver habitat or keeping the beaver there, but have reduced the amount of trail flooding that they were dealing with. And the other sort of tool that can be used for managing beaver or keeping beaver in the area, but protecting some of the vital infrastructure like trees, is tree wiring. And again, the city of Calgary has been a leader in the tree wiring method and technique for a number of years. Doing high wire, narrow mesh, and wide are some of the key tools to making that wiring successful. And if you want to know more about the beaver side of things, I invite you to check out the workingwithbeavers.ca website and learn more about that. So as we close here, a lot of information thrown at you. Unfortunately, I can't see any of you, so I hope you're still with me. The benefits of having creek and wetland riparian areas are great. We know that it's a small part of our watershed, but a really critical and important one. Everything from economic stability, resiliency to flood and drought. The recovery potential is high within riparian areas when the pieces are still in place. So there's something that can be worked on. There's also, the water quality, water quantity, biodiversity element as well. This is Cows and Fish. Like I said, we're a relatively small group, but feel free to contact us or check out our website at cowsandfish.org. We also are on Facebook and on Twitter, and we have a YouTube channel as well, where a number of our presentations are recorded, and you can check them out there. If you want to get a hold of me, I am in Edmonton, but I'm more than happy to chat with anybody. And we also have staff in Calgary as well.
Yeah, thanks, Kerri. That was great introduction to the whole world of riparian habitats and the importance they play in our biodiversity. Yeah, so just a reminder, for those who have questions with Kerri or comments, you're welcome to put them into the chat, and then we can try to answer them as best we can. I was interested in terms of the idea of advertising riparian within the city to the general public walking along our river systems. We have lots of pathways that follow along streams and rivers, et cetera, et cetera. One thing that struck me, it might be interesting to have a map of some sort that shows the different stretches of the river and what the riparian health is. So you could be, walking through an area and find out that this particular stretch riparian functionality is only 30%, and then another little stretch maybe nearby could be 75%, and then people can sort of start to visualize what you're talking about in terms of the functionality of different stretches of the river related to biodiversity.
Interesting. That's an interesting idea.
Yeah, the city of Calgary has a biodiversity advisory committee. So that might be something interesting for them to kind of look into. As to if that could be an educational tool of some sort.
Yeah, and I feel like if it could even be made digital, like an app or something like that, because then it could be updated. Because as we saw from year to year, from every 5-10 years, that health of that site could change. So if you were doing signage or things like that, that could become maybe a little bit expensive. But in this day and age of technology, if you could turn it into an app,
true,
that would be pretty cool.
That's absolutely true. Yeah. I'm an older guy, so apps are still a mystery to me, but
Fair enough.
Yeah, you could have a QR code or something rather, and you could update that as required, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. That's a great idea. Yeah.
And I don't know where, I know that there are full reports for the city of Calgary work that's been done, but like you say, from a site by site perspective, that's interesting. Interesting idea.
Yeah, upstream of the bird sanctuary, there's a stretch that the city has been working hard at trying to repair because it was heavily damaged by the big flood. And so they've been planting willows and various things along the banks to hold the banks, and it's looked like it's working out really, really well. But from my little experience, it seems quite difficult to plug a stick of balsam root or balsam poplar into the ground and hope that it becomes a tree. There seems to be an art to that is kind of hard to kind of make work really well.
It's hard to wrap your head around that a stick that is not growing is going to then grow when it gets put in the ground. And yeah, there is a bit of an art to it. Length of stake that you use, how deep you put it in the ground, what species it is, can all play a part in that. But if you're ever looking for opportunities, watch for the Trout Unlimited website or the Cows and Fish website. We often do volunteer planting days, and people can come out and and learn and do some of that.
Yeah. A question just popped up from Linda. Are there financial benefits offered to farmers and ranchers who protect their riparian areas?
Yeah, great question. So the farmers and ranchers see the benefit of doing riparian management or riparian protection in a couple ways. One is that if their animals are drinking clean water, they are able to graze more, and therefore they gain more weight. And so when they sell the animal, they can sell that animal for more money. Also, if they're not slogging through waters, surface water, then they also have less vet issues, less vet bills because they don't have illnesses and foot rot and things like that. So again, there's an economic benefit there. Now, there are also programs throughout Alberta that a producer can apply to that can get, 50% of a watering system covered, for example, or a portion of the costs of putting in their fence if they want to do some fencing covered as well. So there's sort of that incentive side, as well as just the general operational economic benefit that comes through with having healthy riparian lands.
I see Alan has a question. Where do cows fit into the water issues in Alberta? Is less better? I guess if is less cows better?
Less cows better. I wouldn't say less cows is better per se. It's the way that we inform and educate and have our producers and our agricultural producers managing those cattle. So generally, from the cows and fish perspective, grazing within a riparian area next to a water body is okay. Too many cows, too long, no tools to help pull the animals away, that's when things start to go south. But if we can provide rest to the riparian area, provide water in another place, then that's going to benefit the operation as well as our environment.
Another big question. What is your feeling about using riprap along the riverbanks? I find them very sterile with total habitat loss and question whether it has been overused along the riverbanks in Calgary.
Yeah, that's a great question too. The riprap has been the go-to forever for keeping riverbanks in place. And I think what people are finding is that after a while, they don't keep things in place anymore. So I think you're right, Linda, when you look at, areas of Calgary, particularly in 2013 flood, where banks blew out or things didn't hold themselves together very well, a lot of those places just had rock. So the adding the rock sort of increases the hardened surface, increases the erosion, increases water moving downstream. And so I think the trend now is to combining rock with plants. So that vegetated riprap idea, where you still might need something to hold things together like right away, but then having the plants involved, that makes it a little bit of a longer term solution, and that bank should hold steady better over time.
Mm. Kind of a comment on that. Sometimes I get the feeling that some riprap, a little bit of it perhaps, provides a hibernacula opportunity for garter snakes. Sometimes from what sometimes I've seen a garter snake, and they're kind of associated with riprap because they can work their way down through the rock down somewhere where they can avoid uh, cold weather or something. I'm not sure if that'd be interesting to.
Yeah, well, and it would also heat up quite quickly too,
Mhm.
which I know that's important for snakes too. So, I mean, like anything, usually, things aren't 100% bad or 100% good. There can be an element of good in all of those things, but when we're coming from sort of that bank protection element, definitely being able to combine it with some native bioengineering seems to be a longer term solution.
A couple of questions I might have, just thinking about them. One is, how much water do cows need in a day? I've heard it's a fair bit
Well, when we talk to our grade fives, we say they need a bathtub full. So I think it's about 26 liters a day.
every day. Okay.
Yeah.
And the other question would be, bison. Do they have the same water requirements as cattle?
Good question. I don't know the exact answer to that. I would think it would be similar.
Okay. Because we had at one point herds and herds of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of bison roaming across the landscape before Europeans came in. You wonder what the state of the riparian habitats were. But I guess in some sense the bison are always on the move, so they're not in one spot trying to trampling one area over a period of time, perhaps.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the big differences when you read, through the early explorers journals and things like that. They often came by areas where herds of bison had been, and it was decimated, right? It was bare ground, it was short grass, it was muddy water. But though that herd didn't come back to that spot for, some length of time, sometimes 10, 15 years. And so that gave that riparian area a chance to recover and come back.
Okay.
And so that element of rest was sort of just built into the system. Whereas now, like you said, everything's kind of smaller, everything's more fragmented, not that movement isn't there. So it's up to the managers to help incorporate that rest and rotate the animals around and provide, different places for them to go for water.
Okay, good. Question, not sure if this was asked, but can riparian refer to salt water like ocean borders or just to freshwater borders?
I don't think that was asked, and I'm pretty sure it would be the same word. It would just be different. Your plant species would be completely different. Obviously in a saltwater situation versus a freshwater. So great question. I'm going to Google that when I'm done.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting question for sure. Another question just popped up from Linda. Is most of the cows and fish work done in agricultural areas, or do you also work in the foothills? For example, some of the areas where recreational use of ATVs is the problem.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Working in both areas. So or traditionally, we started in agriculture and did a lot of our work in the agricultural area, particularly in the settled part of the province. But we've also been engaged with leaseholders and public land grazers as well. So along those eastern slopes. And then particularly in the last 3 years, we've actually had an Eastern Slopes program where we've been engaging more with recreational users. So motorized and non-motorized, and helping them understand and get the message out about what riparian areas are and what the impacts they're having are. So yeah, working in all parts of the province with a bunch of different user groups for sure.
It must be quite a strategy in terms of approaching people, whether they're ranchers or other shoreline owners, how to approach them with a gentle nudge to move toward riparian health.
Well, the interesting thing about that is the way Cows and Fish works is we go on an invitation basis. So we actually look for partners who can bring us into an area where we can do a thing like this. And we can basically just tell our story and tell our experience and why riparian areas are important. And then from that, people tend to come to us or they come to their local stewardship group or their county or their municipality and they say, hey, I heard that presentation, something is not right on my land, I want to do something different. And then we can connect each other that way. So we actually don't go looking for problems. We tend to wait until we're invited, and we get a lot of invitations.
Okay, well, that's great to know. Yeah, because I think landowners are really, most of them are really concerned about the health of their land. And if a project like this or program like this can be available to them, they'd be quite happy to take it on.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, the other reason that we like to do these sorts of events is it also gives more information to more people, because we are a small organization. But if there's other people that are taking on the information and are talking to a variety of different people, you know, those messages can get out there faster. And you're right, most of them want to do something that's going to benefit their land and their operation and their longevity and their succession, because they've got kids that they're hoping are going to take over. They've got, you know, a livelihood to make, and the land is what produces it for them. So they're looking after it.
That could be the trick, is to touch on the kids, go to the schools, get the kids excited, and then they bring that back to their parents.
Yeah.
And yeah, because sometimes those kids are the best eco warriors out there, if you want to call them that.
It's true. Yeah, there's actually a game that we have. It's called the Cows, Fish, Cattle, Dogs, and Kids, and it's a big river, a big watershed, and the kids answer questions and roll a big dice, and there's puppets, and it's one way that they can start to learn about wetlands and riparian too.
Cool. Sounds great. All right. I don't see any questions popping up at this point. So I think what we'll do then is we'll end the presentation. And again, thank you very much, Kerri, for coming toward Calgary, virtually at least, to make us aware of the importance of riparians, understand what riparian is, and all the great efforts that Cows and Fish are doing in terms of increasing the awareness and also the health of our wild areas. So thank you very much. I do appreciate it.
Well, again, I thank you for the questions, and I thank you guys for joining us tonight, and I hope that you learned something.
Perfect. Yeah. Yeah. So that ends our presentation for those who are online here. And I thank you all for attending, and I look forward to seeing you again next month. I don't have a speaker as such lined up, but if you have an interesting idea for a speaker, let me know. Otherwise, our next presentation as such will be on February 1st, and that will be our bird study group. We'll be talking, I think it's on molting patterns with birds, something like that. And hopefully you can attend that meeting as well. So thanks a lot, everybody. And I guess because it is our first meeting in January, Happy New Year. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks, Kerri.